This is Environmental Science 1, Chapter 3, Part 2, on how ecosystems work. In this portion of the video lecture, we will be taking a look at how ecosystems change. Because climate doesn't ever stay the same, organisms, populations come and go, and because of human impact reasons, we have ecosystems that will change over time. And we call that change succession. So succession is a regular pattern of changes over time in the type of species in a community. So succession can take hundreds or even thousands of years to occur. And really, because the Earth is a dynamic place, ecosystems very rarely stay the same for any amount of time. There's constant change taking place in ecosystems. The types of organisms can change, especially plant life. What we call an ecosystem that is nice and stable, we call the members in that stable ecosystem a climax community. So it's the final stable community if that ecosystem is left undisturbed. And by undisturbed, I mean undisturbed by human impact. There are two types of succession. Secondary succession you can kind of think as like a do-over or a redo for an ecosystem. So there was an ecosystem that was established, something happened to change it slightly, but you're not starting from scratch. After a natural disaster, for example, forest fires or massive floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, those types of things will leave some of the ecosystem after the event has taken place. Sometimes developed land is abandoned, like a parking lot where the weeds and things are growing up in between the cracks. That's a type of secondary succession. It's taking what's there and kind of doing a redo or a do-over of the biological communities that live in that ecosystem. So you have a previous ecosystem in secondary succession. The first organisms to colonize that new space we call pioneer organisms. So just like the pioneers went across the great wild west of the United States expansion, we have pioneer organisms are the first ones to kind of make the ecosystem their home. Lots of pioneer organisms are very hardy. They have a high tolerance for drought conditions. They have a high tolerance for maybe even colder temperatures. They're grasses, weeds, and wildflowers. So they will have kind of a short lifespan. They bloom, they flower, they die. The cycle repeats. Eventually, some taller plants and shrubs and trees can move into that area. And then a little while later, we can have kind of a small tree forest that will develop into a mature forest. And eventually, again, the ending, or at least the sort of ending spot for the ecosystem would be that the climax community or the climax forest in this case. So our forest fire is always bad. So forest fires, friend or foe. There are areas that actually have fires prescribed every spring or in the fall. Lots of prairie communities are fire maintained. They can be prescribed by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. There are people out there that are supervising. They don't just set the fire and walk away. Certain areas can be burned. Also, you have the natural fires, wildfires, as a part of secondary succession. Lightning strikes often occur and start natural forest fires. Some trees, like the jack pine, can only release their seeds after they're exposed to a lot of heat or flame. So some organisms in the community actually rely on natural or prescribed fires to keep reproducing. Fires aren't always bad either. Prescribed ones, in most cases, will burn out a lot of that dead wood and tree brush and leaf litter. So it would have been a problem if a natural wildfire had started. So sometimes those prescribed burns are used to kind of clean up an area as well. Primary succession, this is where you are going to start an ecosystem from scratch or a clean slate. So primary succession occurs where there really was no ecosystem before, meaning that there was no soil in order for plants to come in the area. Volcanic islands, once the molten lava cools off, that is a very brand new, bare, clean slate type of environment to start from, as well as glaciers. When they retreat, they have scraped kind of all of the soil down to its bare rock. Primary succession takes a lot longer than secondary succession does. So primary succession occurs where there's no soil that is formed. So first, we have to form the soil before we can have our pioneer organisms of the weeds, grasses, and wildflowers move in. So we have to start really from scratch. So we start from bare rock, of course. So we have physical and chemical attributes taking that rock and breaking it down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So we have an organic breakdown of the rock. Lichens, which has a symbiotic or mutualistic relationship between fungus and algae, will grow on this rock, as well as moss. That will eventually start to break the rock down bit by bit. Physical parts of breakdown for soil formation. The freeze-thaw cycle. Water is one of those interesting compounds that are actually larger and expand when it is frozen, as opposed to most molecules that will actually shrink when they're cold. Water will work its way down to cracks and crevices and freeze and expand and thaw and kind of have that contraction, and that kind of accordion-like back and forth motion will slowly break that rock down over time. So eventually we'll start to get some organic layers of very thin soil that will start to form. Pioneer organisms, again, they can deal with very hardy conditions. So a lot of those beginning grasses and weeds and wildflowers don't need much soil in order to grow. So as they grow and die and the cycle continues every season, we start to get a buildup of a nice organic layer, a nice topsoil layer with a lot of good nutrients in it. So other grasses and shrubs and trees can then move into the area. So taking a look at from bare rock, we can start to break that down. Organic materials can help do that. So moss and lichens and fungus will start to break these things down. Eventually, we can get a nice, good, healthy soil profile built up with different horizons. So you have an organic layer that starts to develop, which will let more plant life come in to grow. And eventually, once we have enough to support thicker vegetation, then we can start to move in our trees and our shrubs, and then our mature trees, and then finally the climax community. This has been Environmental Science 1, Chapter 3, How Ecosystems Work, Part 2.